The subject here, of course, is this symbol C-51, and it's become a symbol at one level, but it's also, of course, a very, very complex piece of legislation. And it's an omnibus piece of legislation that brings together a variety of different issues that, in my view, don't belong in the same legislation. I'd like to talk about two parts of Bill C-51 that I think are critically important and which I think the Liberal government can and should reform radically. That is part one of the bill, which is the Information Sharing Act. Part two of C-51 is called SATA, the Secure Air Travel Act. And what it does, it allows the minister to establish a no-fly list. Now, the no-fly list provision had been in place for a number of years under a program called Passenger Protect. And what SATA does is expand that to the whole range of terrorist provisions that have been added to the criminal code and expanded in the criminal code. Now, you can be a terrorist and not be an immediate threat to the airplane you're about to board, and you can be a threat to the airplane you're about to board and not be a terrorist. So that's contradiction number one. The other contradiction is this, that for all of those terrorist offenses that are established in the criminal code and which now allow you to get on the no-fly list, the question should be asked that who are the people who are so dangerous that they cannot get on an airplane and yet so innocent that they cannot be arrested under the expanded provisions of the criminal code, the terrorist offenses? So you have this really weird kind of set of contradictions in this legislation, which the Liberal government is trying to kind of figure out. So that's the first thing I'd say. Now, what should be done, in my view, the no-fly list provisions are just riddled with so many profound contradictions that it's not going to do any good. It's not going to serve the purpose that it was intended. Is it going to be scrapped? No. The other one is the Security of Canada Information Sharing Act. SCISA is the acronym, which allows more extensive information sharing between government departments for, quotes, activities that undermine the security of Canada, and for that to be triggered, that means undermining the sovereignty, security, territorial integrity of Canada, or the lives or security of people in Canada. So immediately, therefore, you have a very vague definition, a very vague threshold for the ability to share information. That's been pointed out by the Privacy Commissioner on a number of occasions. Secondly, the information should be shared if it is relevant to the jurisdiction of the recipient institution, and that could mean anything you want it to mean. And so the combination of those particular provisions means, I think, that where national security agencies, our national security agencies would have a virtually limitless powers to monitor Canadians for a whole range of different reasons that come under this vague definition. My final point is this, that we have in this country a Privacy Act. It was passed in 1982, and it should establish the rules by which federal agencies collect, use, disclose, disseminate personal data. It is way out of date. It was out of date in 1982, right? And privacy commissioners for the last 30 years have been appealing for its modernization. The Liberal government is not going to repeal C-51, right? It ain't going to happen, right? As much as groups might want that to happen, they're sort of stuck with it. And furthermore, there was an opinion poll a couple of weeks ago which said that actually Canadians a majority of them support it with proper amendments. So the debate going forward, therefore, should be about accountability, it should be about oversight, it should be about listening in particular to what our oversight agencies say concerning what was wrong with the original bill, and that's particularly the Privacy Commissioner's views. And so that's sort of where I am on this.
It's getting the news headlines that really more people are killed by moose in Canada than have been by terrorists. And I'm not so sure that will change much in the way, if we treat terrorists as common criminals, motivated maybe by religion, but just as common criminals. I wonder why we're spending $1 billion on all this. Why aren't we putting the same sort of emphasis and law rigor on the money launderers from criminal activity, from people smuggling, all these other things which affect a lot more people and do a hell of a lot more damage?
You'd have to ask the politicians why they aren't putting more effort into those areas. Terrorism is very dramatic. It grabs the headlines when it happens.
Once the security card is played, right, it has a tendency to overwhelm other arguments of dissent that might be made against it. And I think that's a lot of what's going on with respect to C-51. It was passed in a period of moral panic and without adequate debate.
It doesn't need to be repealed. It isn't going to be in pragmatic political terms anyway. But I don't see a need for it to be repealed, in part because the threat is not easing, as you all know from the things that have been happening in other parts of the world, and luckily so far not much in Canada, but could still happen. But it does need to be reformed. It should be seriously rebuilt to improve the accountability mechanism that the current version of the Act assigns only to CIRC, the Security Intelligence Review Committee. But there's a major difference between review and oversight. The British and American counterparts to CIRC are based in the elected part of government. That is in Parliament in the UK and in Congress in the US. And they engage in oversight. Review means looking at something after it's happened. Oversight means looking at something while it's happening.
The Canadian security complex, will they have to start justifying their existence? I look at this terrorist case in, quote unquote, in Victoria right now, and in British Columbia with the RCMP, which is now being looked upon as a possibility of entrapment. When you make these laws, or you build it, people come, sort of, you have to, I mean, once you put these laws into place, they also have to justify those laws by coming up with something sooner or later. Or
once you're inside, it's very difficult to learn to talk about outside that loop, what you've learned inside it. This is my problem with the accountability mechanisms represented in particular by CIRC. The Security Intelligence Review Committee, and in the case of CSE, the Commissioner of CSE, are very constrained as to what they can say publicly. They report to the Minister in classified report form, so the public will never learn very much about what they find.
But we badly need a much more effective accountability system. If possibly to conduct oversight. If that's the case, then it should be based in Parliament.
I don't think Canadians ever get the memo on how terrified people in other countries are becoming of Canadians. I think we're so wrapped up in security and thinking that we're fearful of what might hit us. We don't get the story about the corruption in trade about what's happening with Canadian miners, about how individual communities, not only here, but in other places, are terrified and unprotected, and to help people get wealthy, which is where I really see this huge divide in terms of wealth, being at the root of what terrorism is.
I do hold firmly and unwaveringly and forever that it should be repealed. And so my approach to things as an activist is slightly different than, like I said, what might be said today, but it's also looking at who is affected and in what ways. And when it comes to activism, there's so much more to that than complaining. Do you know what I mean? There's so much more to that than holding a picket sign. There's times when maybe for some people it is that, and maybe it is a sense of connecting with community, and maybe it is a sense of something to do on a Saturday noon. Maybe, and that's fine, and I think we need to have those spaces, and they need to be just as safe as any other sort of interaction that we have. But there are also communities where this is the only way for them to interact with this thing we like to call democracy. And so when it comes to communities that are deeply affected, activist communities, First Nations communities, refugee and undocumented communities, etc., this bill is very dangerous. And so when there is a barrier between you conversing with the government, I think that's wildly inappropriate. And I think we need to really rethink that. And we need to ask ourselves, why is it that we have this bill, now law, in Canada that creates these barriers for something so fundamental to democracy, and something so important?
This is not one act.
No.
It's a collection of them,
Yeah.
and the motivations are complex,
Yeah.
right? You know, and that's the root of the problem, right? Yes, there is certainly implications. There are certainly consequences for legitimate dissent, absolutely. But you know, trying to sort of tease out what the problem is. What is the problem what is the problem to which C-51 is the solution? I do not know the answer to that question.
When I was 9 years old, NATO, which Canada is a part of, bombed my country. So while y'all were bombing my country, my only way of interacting with the government and my family's only way of interacting with the government to say, hey, maybe stop doing that, maybe stop killing my family members and making them live in a basement, my only way of doing that was through protest and through activism. And that was how I spent my grade 4 year, grade 5, whatever that was. And so to have that taken away for any community is dangerous waters. That's some dangerous stuff for us to tread. And so for us to even have conversations about taking that right away, or putting up, let's not go that far, or putting up barriers between that conversation with the government when you don't have voting power, for us to put up any sort of barriers, that conversation is scary and it's dangerous. But for us to follow through with that, to go through first, second, third reading through Parliament, to go through the Senate, to be enacted into law, to become law of the land in June, what? I mean, how is there not more outrage? That is atrocious. That should not be happening in Canada. And that's why I focus so strongly on this. It's not like we had no laws. That's what I want to say. It's not like we had nothing in place and it was this lawless place and now we need these really strict measures to make sure that things don't happen. Of course we need those things to not happen in Canada. And those laws exist already, and maybe we can tinker with them as we do with laws, but to introduce a law that we know is flawed and to act on it and to vote it in when we know it's flawed is not doing politics correctly. And that's bad faith. You're voting in a law in bad faith. I don't think in my heart of hearts that it'll be repealed, but I don't think it's impossible, because the Minister of Justice is the person who can put forward a list in accordance with the Repeal Statutes Act. Every year, a list of things we can repeal, and then December 31st of that year, those things are repealed. So it's not impossible and it's not unheard of. and it's certainly something I would advocate for. And if there are parts of C-51 that could be useful, that are important, we need to look at those separately, rather than an omnibus bill that just amends things at this wild umbrella under the term in general, terrorism in general. I mean, I can't imagine leaving your fate in those words. Your fate to go to court, to be put on a no-fly list, to have your entire life ruined, to never have a job again because of the words in general. Your life, your everything, your family. Terrorism in general. So me, I fall into this category, and some other familiar faces who were at protests because we were in sites of important infrastructure, and I mean, they're not going to, but if they felt like it, and if they really had something against me, they could twist those words enough and enough and enough over and over to make me fall into that category of political protest and a site of infrastructure, terrorism in general. Again, they're not going to do it, and you don't need to be afraid to go to protests. I mean, that's not what I'm trying to say. But just the very fact that we have the language written in such a way that that could maybe happen is a little bit weird to me.
It's time for me and for other activists, I think, to look at what's behind all this. In other words, to use another metaphor, to go upstream to the global headwaters. What is going on? What has Canada done? Canada has militarily participated in the killing of civilians all over the world. From Afghanistan to Iraq to now Syria to Haiti, and we have economically and militarily participated and assisted the killing of civilians in many more countries, from Colombia to the Philippines. We are part of the world's most sophisticated military machine, which has been built, created, and operates for the sole purpose of maintaining its global dominance. It maintains its global dominance through Canada's aid to mining companies, as Jane pointed out. We help kill people in Mexico, in Guatemala, in Chile, Peru, in Papua New Guinea, through our economic militarism. So all of a sudden, the war has come home. We've been doing this for decades. France has been doing it for decades. Belgium and France were doing it for centuries. And so has Britain, and so has the United States of America. How do you fight the most sophisticated military machine in the world? You do it by a form of small guerrilla activity. And why do we think that we are immune from a war coming home to us? And if we don't want terrorism in our own country, then why aren't we acting and participating in the struggle for peace and social justice all over the world, from Papua New Guinea to Palestine, to Haiti, to Iraq, where we participated militarily some decades ago and are again now? We have a lot to ask ourselves. And as an activist, I think it's very important that those overriding global issues be considered when we start talking about Section A, B, 1C of an act. We are dictating global economic and military dominance. We're part of the machine. And we're just a junior partner of NATO and the United States of America. And if we aren't willing to accept that, all these laws will be futile. The war is going to come home.
If we're continuing to propel these systems of oppression and racism while enacting laws like C-51 and constantly going back to, oh, but it's scary, things are happening. Well, why are these things happening? And what is our response? Like, this is our response? Really? This, C-51? Come on, we can do better than that. Maybe also we should have stopped bombing Syria or never bombed Syria to begin with. Maybe we shouldn't be involved with Libya.
They're all Muslim countries. That's why the Muslims have the Muslim people.
And the not too bad that, you know, if it stays in the bill, I don't think there's any great big deal. For example, going back all the way back to the Anti-Terrorism Act of 2001, the powers of preventive arrest and investigative hearings, which have been kind of upgraded and expanded in C-51, but they've never been used, and they lapsed for 6 years after Parliament voted them down a few years ago, and you know the security of Canada didn't seem to be in danger because of that, but they brought them back. The Conservatives brought it back. It'll have to be renewed again in 2018, and I don't think that's a big deal one way or another if that stays in the bill, and I wouldn't worry about it. We have to have a no-fly list. We have to have it because the Americans will insist on it. And if we don't have ours, then they're going to impose theirs. And that was the original reason why we had the Passenger Protect program. And now in fact, what we've done is we've turned what was not an unreasonable and modest kind of no-fly list into something that looks like the discredited American one. I don't know, that's not much in the way of progress at all, but we could certainly go back at least to many of the elements that were there in the first instance. Information sharing is not, I mean, you know, it's a good idea in principle. That, I mean, you certainly don't want to have one government agency knowing some piece of a puzzle that when comes together is going to be a terrorist attack that takes, you know, innocent lives, et cetera, et cetera. You want them to be able to do that. But the way that this has been done, one, is that it has been widened recklessly without the controls to protect privacy.
Now they've got something called transition. Transition is being used now to justify the continuation of the current practices such as Site C dams, such as fracking, such as pipelines, the tar sands. When people start opposing what he's going to be doing, what's going to happen? That is interfering with economic security. And one last thing, we need to redefine what constitutes security. It's not military security. It is security of human rights, peace, environment, and social justice. That's what we should concentrate on. Nothing is really defined in this. What constitutes threat? What constitutes security?
When C-51 puts people at threat of, even by accident, being on a no-fly list, or even for reasons such as through activism or opposing pipelines, if you get to the airport and you find out you're on a no-fly list, and your only way of getting off of it is to appeal to the minister, I mean, what is that saying in Canada when we're bringing forward laws like that? What is that saying to the state of democracy here in Canada? What is that saying for our rights? And this is actually the conversation we're having.
Then we get to the really, really ugly. And here is what I think there is absolutely no justification for keeping in the bill in any form, should be absolutely thrown out in its entirety. And I'm speaking about the disruption warrants for so-called disruption warrants for CSIS. Suddenly CSIS, a security intelligence agency which is tasked to gather intelligence, security intelligence for the government of Canada, is going to be turned into this kind of James Bond outfit that's going to go around and disrupt and so on. But the absolutely horrific part of this is the warrants where they would feel that it might be necessary in the course of their disruption that they would violate Canadian law and that they could violate the charter rights of Canadians, and they would go to a judge, federal court judge, and ask for a warrant that would permit them to do this. Anything short of, wait for it, murder, torture, or rape. Now that's a no-no, but anything short of that might be authorized. And this turns federal judges from protectors of the rights of citizens into enforcers of the executive. in violating the rights of citizens. And that's an appalling thing to do. I don't know whether any federal judges would actually want to consent to that, but, you know, it's written into the law. CSIS, a security intelligence agency without policing powers, has turned into a force authorized to operate against citizens without checks. The entire process in secret, with only the CSIS case presented to a judge. No follow-up, no post hoc review of whether warrant powers were used effectively or abused in the actual event. And if they're operating abroad, CSIS doesn't even need warrants. That they could, in fact, CSIS could be snatching Canadians abroad and dealing them as they feel like. I mean, this is just appalling. And also the fact is that the RCMP, which are a law enforcement agency, they disrupt as well, but they do so with an eye to bringing a case to court in which the evidence is going to stand up and they can get a conviction. In fact, accountability is not going to be public transparency. And if you have a security cleared parliamentary committee, for example, in fact, once you're inside the loop, you can't really disclose what you've learned when you're inside the loop.
The process of what we're doing with this specific legislation is a black box as well. And how do we open that black box up so that people like us and others in Canada can have some input into changing this, if not repealing it altogether?
The basic answer is read Hansard. We live in a country that operates in a parliamentary Westminster model with a tremendous amount of publicly available record of discussion at the executive level of the elected level of government. So when a committee is struck, its findings, its discussion, the appearance of witnesses, the emerging conclusions and directions all appear very soon. I mean, the people who take notes for Hansard, the media won't do it for you. They'll report the sort of sensational stuff.